Good morning, I'm Mat Schaffer. Welcome back to the Boston Sunday Review. The Institute for Community Inclusion promotes the inclusion of people with disabilities in society. Dr. Bill Kiernan, director of the ICI, joins us this morning on the BSR. Good morning.
Morning, Matt. How are you doing?
How inclusive is your definition of disabled?
Well, let me go back and give you a little bit of the history of the ICI and how it got started. It was actually started through a piece of federal legislation in President Kennedy's era, when he was unhappy with the fact that many professionals who worked in the field of mental retardation didn't work together. And he was concerned about the services that were available for his sister, Rosemary. And so that started this whole national movement called University Centers of Excellence in Disabilities, which the Institute is one of. And so our original basis was around mental retardation. We've evolved over the time now that we take a definition that's very consistent with what is considered the one used for the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's very broad. It includes individuals who have had disabilities from birth on. It includes individuals who acquired disabilities in later years.
And when we're talking about disabilities, we're talking about everything from visual disabilities to intellectual disabilities to physical disabilities.
Sure, including also psychiatric disabilities, disabilities acquired through the normal aging process.
And how inclusive is your definition of inclusive?
If you look out the window, that's our definition of inclusion. The community, and we really believe strongly that people with disabilities ought to have access to the same opportunities, resources, and events that anybody else has.
Is the perception still out there that people with disabilities can't work, go to college, and are generally limited in their activities?
I think so. I think that that's one of the standard perceptions. And over the years, and when I was going through school, Matt, I'm sure when you were going through school, we didn't see people with disabilities in the regular classrooms. Now, in the last decade and a half, we're seeing many more students with disabilities in the typical community classroom. And so the expectation of people of the more current generations are that they see people with disabilities and they understand them and they have a perception. For us, we didn't see them, and so we don't really have expectations.
And so certainly part of your mission is to change these stereotypes.
Absolutely.
And to move beyond them,
right.
Perhaps.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Through training, consultation, clinical and employment services, and research.
That's right. Those are the mandates that we follow, although we have a series of projects that deal in those areas.
So the mission is large, and the approach is multi-dimensional.
Right, it is. We are less of a service organization and more of a capacity development, building resources, building the ability for other programs to support people with disabilities in typical community settings, and that could be in early intervention, it could be in typical early education, it could be in school, it could be in the adult community, it could be in work.
How much of it, Bill, is about a national discussion like we had just recently, for example, on whether to use the R word?
Well, a lot of it is that. I think the common denominator for most persons with disabilities is they have a first name. And that's probably the best thing to use, and not necessarily the so-called R word. And on occasion, the R word's used because historically, 20, 30 years ago, that was the common terminology. Now we're much better than that. We understand that people are people first.
How much is it about legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act?
I think the Americans with Disabilities Act was a very interesting piece of legislation in the sense that it declared in some ways that this was a group that was being discriminated or disadvantaged, and that they should have and they must have the same opportunities as everybody else. The other side of that nickel raises the question, which is what you had asked before, the perception about people with disabilities in the community. We had to pass legislation to say that people with disabilities had the same rights that you and I have.
How much of it then is enforcement of legislation like the ADA and moving towards a time when that won't be an issue?
It's getting to be less and less so of an issue. The enforcement side of the ADA has when it first passed, was really around the issues of access to buildings and facilities and transportation and restaurants and those sorts of areas. now the enforcement of the ADA has often been around people being excluded from arenas such as schools or in jobs and those sorts of environments. So what we're seeing is the enforcement, the stick, so-called stick of the ADA, is becoming less of a stick because there's probably a better perception about people with disabilities.
How much is ensuring that people with disabilities are integrated into our educational system at every level?
That's at the core of it. That's at the core. If we start out with opportunities for very young kids to experience the differences among kids, and some of those happen to be disabilities, some of them are also cultural. Those kids grow up and they have a very different perspective about people with disabilities in their adult years.
How much is helping? Is it about helping people with disabilities find employment?
The employment side is probably one of the bigger challenges for us of people with disabilities, and it's complicated by a couple of areas. One is that if you're told your entire life you can't do anything, at some point you might begin to internalize that and say, I can't. If you're also told that in going up through school that there really isn't a clear sense of expectation you're going to go to work, then the expectation you're going to go to work is pretty low.
How much of it is about positive role models in the media?
I think it's terrific that what the media's been doing over the past, I would say, almost 2 decades. But when you looked at some of the events like on Sesame Street, when you saw kids in wheelchairs, now obviously some disabilities you can't see. There's some that you can see, and you can realize that, in fact, if somebody's signing, that they've got some sort of limitations, or if they're in a wheelchair, they've got some sort of limitation. And when you see those kids interacting with other kids in those sorts of environments, that's a great lesson for kids in general. It's also a great lesson for adults.
And finally, how much is it about listening to people with disabilities to hear what they say, what they want, and what they say they need?
Well, that's what is at the crux of the matter in the movement around self-advocacy and self-determination for persons with disabilities to have a voice. And it's great for people with disabilities to have a voice. What we need is people without disabilities to have ears and to listen and to hear what's being said and then to take it seriously. But there are clearly some times where people with disabilities will say things that you don't agree with, just like people without disabilities, and there'll be times that they'll make decisions that, in fact, that we will feel aren't necessarily in their best interest, just like people without disabilities.
I mean, ultimately, it seems to me all this is boiling down to RESPECT.
Right. You're exactly right. And basically looking at difference, not necessarily as a liability, but as an asset.
How do you help people with disabilities find employment in community settings, and why is that important for both the individual and his or her community?
Well, work is sort of, let me go back and answer that in a couple of different ways. One of which is that work is really basically the second question that most new people ask you. When somebody meets you for the first time, they just generally ask you, what's your name? Just as we did when we first met. What's your name? And then the typical second question is, what do you do? And in this country, we define ourselves in the adult world, whether you like it or not, we define them by our occupation and what we do. And in many instances, frankly, a lot of our social relationships now come out of our workplace, whereas some decades ago that wasn't the case. But what's really important about people with disabilities in the workplace is it gives them a number of things. One is it gives them a source of income, so that, in fact, for a lot of people with disabilities, the real issue is poverty. The second thing is it gives them a pathway to make friends in relationships, to develop those so-called social networks. And then the third one is it gives them the answer to the second question that any new person asks them. How easy is it and how difficult is it? We're making some progress, and we still have a long way to go with the assumption that people with disabilities can be incorporated into the workplace. There's been some interesting changes in the demographics in this country as we look at the older worker who participates in the workplace. With age, our body generally starts to slow down a little bit. Not all of us always wear glasses all of our lives. Our memories aren't always that perfect. And in some instances, people who are older need some supports in the workplace. Those supports are not terribly different than the supports we give to some people who can't see as well or don't remember as well or get things confused.
Even with all the legislation, is it still tough for people with disabilities to access our education system?
It depends on what education system we're talking about. If we're talking about the elementary and secondary education, it's an entitlement. Then it's not difficult to access it. Sometimes it's difficult to be fully included in the educational setting.
In every school in America?
Not in every school in America. I think we've got some schools that are just terrific at full inclusion of students with disabilities, and other schools that still are apprehensive about that. What you also find is that, by the way, is the adult system, the post-secondary settings, the community colleges, and higher education, there's less opportunity oftentimes for people with disabilities, particularly people with intellectual disabilities that participate in that.
Do special needs programs do enough, and are special needs kids fully integrated into school populations as much as you guys over at the ICI would like to see them be?
Well, the very quick answer is no. Now, the longer-term answer is that have we come a long way? We have in some arenas, and we've done some really nice things. Not we, but the general community has done some very nice things in including kids with disabilities in a wide range of settings. We still have a long way to go, and we still have some schools that will tend to look at students with disabilities really needing a separate and segregated settings. For us, that's a little hard to think that should be the first option. It should be absolutely the last option to consider.
And surprisingly, as you just said, you were saying that once we get on to higher education, some of those opportunities become minimal or minimized.
They drop down a lot, and they drop down for certain groups, not for all people with disabilities. It's not uncommon to find, for example, we're at the University of Mass in Boston, that a number of the students at UMass Boston are wheelchair users and have disabilities. Where it becomes more apparent that it's difficult for students to get into the community college or college setting is students who have intellectual disabilities or students who have significant mental health issues and those areas we find students have more difficulty in getting in.
What challenges are faced by the folks attempting to transition from school to independent adult life?
I think the challenges are in many ways not terribly different than the individual who's transitioning without a disability. There's a lot of complex opportunities that exist for people. The issue is that oftentimes we don't have the support resources. For example, students with disabilities in the secondary settings, when it comes time to transition to a post-secondary setting, again, a community college or a college, or into adult life, the educational system could do better. We could do better in facilitating the movement of that student into their adult life. Some school districts do a pretty good job at it, and others are still saying that their role is really to transition the student to the adult services system only.
The Institute for Community Inclusion promotes technologies that aid participation in school, community, and work activities.
Right.
Like what?
Let me give you some examples of the technology that's really pretty interesting to think a bit about. And that's that it was only probably 15 years ago where people were saying, oh, you don't really need to have closed captioning on television. In these days, you can't even buy a television and forget the law says it. You wouldn't be able to buy one now because, in fact, everybody's agreed that closed captioning really is a benefit. One time, when you look at the users of closed captioning, it's users in the athletic clubs and the sports clubs and everything else, plus people who necessarily need that captioning to see what's going on the television. The most frequent users of curb cuts tend to be women who have strollers or people who are dragging their suitcases along. Now, those were not put in for strollers. They happen to work really well for it. If you looked at the access to buildings and you got levers and all, those are much easier than those small doorknobs, and most of us now open the doors when our hands are full with our elbows as opposed to our hands. So it's that type of technology. Now, there's a whole bunch of other technology that exists that really facilitates the access of persons with disabilities into the community. What we look at is those technologies that have universal application that benefit a wider audience, have a quicker take-up and a quicker level of acceptance. And the other thing they do, which is what in fact gets back to our core belief, is that if more people use the technology is no longer special. It's relevant to everybody.
So it ceases to be special needs, just becomes needs.
Absolutely.
The ICI helps build organizations' ability to serve culturally diverse people with disabilities. How so?
Well, let me give you an example. Actually, tell you a story about this more than anything else. Is that there's a project that we have that's actually working with one of the Haitian groups, HAFI. And it is a joint program that's working with that group to increase the understanding of issues of depression. And what we're doing is we're working with HAFI and with one of the media networks to create some soap operas that will talk about depression as something that's treatable and able to be served and supported. So in that case, what we're trying to do is use the typical media and getting a message embedded in that media that talks about something that can be dealt with that in that community is oftentimes not necessarily talked loudly about. So that's a very concrete example. Some of the other examples in looking at some of the cultural differences of building the capacity for a range of small community-based minority organizations, because they have access to those communities to reach out and to talk about, yes, in fact, disabilities is part of the human experience and does have a role in this community. And your son or daughter, your cousin, your niece or nephew, or the neighbor down the street, or the person who's in the community-based organization and the house or the clubhouse, the center, everything else, can really do something. So it's those messages that we really want to get across, not to say that they have to go someplace special.
And then you guys are studying the impact of national and state policies on people with disabilities and their families, just to make sure that this is all working?
No, it's actually to look at what are some of the policies and practices that really would have a benefit. And again, I'll go back to a couple of examples. We actually work with the Corporation for National and Community Services. Most people would know that organization by the programs that they support, like City Year, AmeriCorps, Senior Corps, Vista, those sorts of programs. And our effort is really around creating access for persons with disabilities in those programs. And so in that legislation, there's a mandate to say that a certain percentage of the money has to be reserved for creating access for persons with disabilities in those programs. Now, this is to say that people with disabilities who want to do voluntary work should have the opportunity to do it, not in groups, individually, sort of incorporating people. And there's some examples even in the Boston area where City Year has had people with disabilities who really have been part of the teams. Those are great opportunities for experiences. And so that's just one simple example. Another example is that trying to change some of the rules of some of our systems, like the Social Security system, a rather large bureaucracy. And the Social Security system basically winds up allocating money and payments for persons with disabilities to stay out of the workforce. Because if you're receiving Social Security benefits, oftentimes the consequence of earnings is you lose your Social Security benefits, and more importantly, your health care benefits. And so we've been working with Social Security to try and change some of the rules and some of the regulations that allow people to go back to work and not put all of their resources at risk or the health care benefits at risk. In Massachusetts, we're a little bit better than most of the other states in that arena.
You have dozens of projects from A, access to integrated employment, to W, the Workforce Development Excellence Initiative. What are they?
The Workforce Development Excellence Initiative is really around, with the passage of the Workforce Investment Act, there was a concept that there should be one place for any job seeker to go that would find a job. So it's technically a no wrong door concept. In some of our systems, again, when we get all these special programs, somebody will come along, somebody applies to something and say, oh, no, you're at the wrong office. You got to go over here. You got to go over there. The concept of the one-stop career center was really to create a pathway for any job seeker to find a job. Any meant not any, all, but people with disabilities. It meant all. And so that system that hadn't necessarily served people with disabilities was then mandated to provide some services to people with disabilities and to bring in some of the resources like the Mass Rehab Commission and all. So the concept of the workforce development system was to create a smoother, more streamlined access to jobs.
ICI projects and programs involve local, state, and national agencies, schools, institutes of higher education, national service programs, rehabilitation providers, multicultural organizations, and employers. Do you reach out to them or they to you?
Well, it's a combination of things. We get a lot of our resources come from the federal government and from state contracts. But the federal grants usually our motto is to really build the capacity of the system. And so, for example, I'll give you one quick example, and that's in the post-secondary settings, which we talked about before, the community colleges. There was a piece of legislation that was passed 2 years ago that we were pretty centrally involved with, which was to create post-secondary options for students with intellectual disabilities. These are typically students who don't read so well, don't write so well, didn't do so well in school, and probably had trouble in getting through the school system. Some will get a high school diploma, some won't. But what we've really looked at is that the final 4 years of school from 18 to 22 can be much more meaningfully spent if it's in a community college setting. And these students can audit classes, can participate in classes, but what they do get is some sense of expectation that there's a future, that there's a world that's going to be different. The conversation in the high school cafeteria is palpably different than the conversation in the community college environment where people are talking about my future, my job, and in the high school, we're talking about other things.
What is the concept of universal design, and is it universal?
We hope it's getting more universal. But the concept of universal design would be somewhat similar to what we talked about before, was that in looking at some accommodations or some strategies that we use for people with disabilities, if they're more quickly, they'll be more quickly taken up if, in fact, the general population feels as though the benefit.
So that wherever you go, there's going to be curb cuts. In any elevator, there's going to be a noise that lets you know if you can't see that you're on another floor.
Right. Those are the types of designs. Then what you do is you also look at from the standpoint of it's not just physical access, it's programs. So, for example, the academic environment, what we try and look at is working with schools to develop curriculum that deals with all students and all students who learn in different ways.
Bill, how do other countries measure up in terms of their treatment of their disabled citizens? I know you guys travel abroad to share your expertise with other countries.
Right. It's each of the countries is a bit different, and so a lot of our interactions with other countries are more in the adult side of things, and so we look at employment and post-secondary settings and transition. I'll give you a couple of examples. Recently, we addressed the European Union on supported employment. There were about 15 countries that were involved in there, and it was very clear to us that in the U.S., we're further along in understanding some of the concepts. We have some delivery systems sometimes that have been built up over time that we need to change, and we need to improve the capacity of them to help people with disabilities get in jobs. More concretely, we were approached by Saudi Arabia to whether we would be interested in setting up a whole employment system for people with disabilities in Saudi Arabia. And the first effect of that was we went over and visited and spent some time over there, and there is no system. And so in some ways, when you look at that, that's an interesting opportunity because you don't have to deconstruct anything. You're constructing things, but you're also constructing an expectation in Saudi Arabia that people with disabilities ought to be out in the community. In this country, we don't have to deal with that at this point because I think the general person says, yeah, the people with disabilities ought to be out in the community. The other side of the coin, though, for us...
You're saying there are countries where people with disabilities are not expected to be part of the community.
I think that's very true. Yeah, I think in some countries you get some very different perceptions about the role and expectations of persons with disabilities.
Does the World Wide Web help level the playing field?
Oh, for sure it does.
What are accessible websites?
Accessible websites mean that basically the site that you're going on, if a person is visually impaired, you can use an application, whether it's JAWS or some screen reader, so that they can see what in fact are here technically, what in fact is on the website, and so there can be some screening and devices. We work very hard to make sure that all of our sites are accessible, and I think we're pretty good at that side of things, and we help businesses to make sure that their sites are accessible as well. But what we're really looking at is that if we want to get materials and information out, some of the users of our material are going to be people with disabilities, and if they can't get to it, it's not very useful.
When you get a call from a country like Saudi Arabia, I would think that would sort of give you a sense of a little bit of hope.
It actually does, and the call actually came from the royal family, who has a member with a disability. And so in some ways, when somebody calls and says, would you consider setting up employment opportunities for people with disabilities, you know they've come to some terms with the way they're dealing with people with disabilities or supporting them is not adequate.
How has the recession impacted funding for many of these programs?
Well, there's going to be two answers to this one. And the first answer is that the recession and the cutbacks at the state level and at the federal level have impacted some of the resources that are available to programs that serve people with disabilities in their adult years, as well as in schools. And there's less resources that are available. That means a couple of things. One is that some people will not always get served, and that's difficult. It also means that in a tighter economy, we've got to decide how we do business differently. Now, the second answer to that question is on the recession of if we're interested in finding jobs for people with disabilities and more people are being laid off, do we just give up and decide that, this recession will have to pass before we look at people with disabilities getting into employment? And that's not the case. Yes, in fact, people with disabilities lose jobs at a bit of a higher rate than people without disabilities in this economy, but they can find jobs too. And so what it really does with us in the recession is it means we've got to work harder, as everybody has to work harder to make ends meet and to move systems together. It is tougher.
You are one of those organizations that should you one day achieve your goals, you can put yourself out of business.
That's our goal. That's absolutely our goal. We would love nothing other than be out of the business and into something that's different. Although I think that there will always be a role for recognizing, capitalizing on the different skills and talents of our general population. And that's the skills and talents of people who come with different cultural backgrounds, different academic skills, and, for example, different age cohorts.
In a country that prides itself on diversity, you're calling for an expanded definition of diverse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we'd really like to see is diversity becomes a secondary question, and we just look at it and we say, it's just is an interesting mix of folks out here. And diversity, what we'd like to look at when you talk about disability or difference, you talk about oftentimes there's a negative quality to it. We want to really turn that around and say that it's an asset. Everybody's got an asset and a skill and an ability that they can do. Sometimes, and going back to your very early on question, sometimes we, people without disabilities, don't hear people with disabilities when they talk about what they can do.
The ICI strives to create a world where all people of all abilities are welcome and fully included in valued roles wherever they go.
That's right. And when we reach that objective, we'll be out of a job and we'll be into a different job, maybe into media.
For more information, you can visit communityinclusion.org. Dr. William Kiernan, Director of the Institute for Community Inclusion. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the opportunity.
And you are tuned to the Boston Sunday Review.